One family built the largest fortune in American history, then watched it crumble in just 3 generations. The Vanderbilts didn't just lose money. They lost an empire that once controlled the entire transportation backbone of the United States. This is how they did it. Cornelius Vanderbilt started with nothing. Born in 1794 on Staten Island, he quit school at 11 to work on his father's ferry. At 16, he borrowed $100 from his mother and bought his first boat. That single vessel became the foundation of a transportation monopoly that would reshape America. But here's what most people miss about Vanderbilt's rise. He wasn't some visionary entrepreneur with grand plans. He was a street fighter who saw every business deal as warfare. His competitors called him ruthless. That was putting it mildly. Vanderbilt began with ferries in New York Harbor, undercutting every rival until they either sold to him or went bankrupt. By the 1830s, he'd moved into steamships, running routes up and down the East Coast. When the California gold rush hit in 1849, Vanderbilt saw his opening. He built a route through Nicaragua, cutting travel time to the West Coast by days. Competitors charged $800 for passage. Vanderbilt charged half that and still made a fortune. His tactics bordered on predatory. He'd enter a market, slash prices below cost, bleed his competitors dry, then buy their operations for pennies. Once he controlled the route, prices went back up. Passengers had no choice but to pay. The pattern repeated across every waterway he touched. Then came the pivot that defined his legacy. In 1863, at age 69, when most men were planning retirement, Vanderbilt made a bet that seemed insane. He sold his entire shipping empire and poured everything into railroads. People thought he'd lost his mind. Steamships were proven, railroads were chaotic, dangerous, and hemorrhaging money. But Vanderbilt understood something others didn't. America was expanding westward, and whoever controlled the rails would control the country's economic future. He started by acquiring the New York and Harlem Railroad, a struggling line that everyone assumed was worthless. Within months, he turned it profitable. Then, he bought the Hudson River Railroad, then the New York Central. Each acquisition gave him more control over routes into and out of New York City, the nation's commercial heart. Vanderbilt's railroad strategy was even more aggressive than his shipping tactics. He'd buy a competing line, then refuse to connect his tracks to theirs. Freight and passengers had to unload, cross town, and reload on his trains. It was inconvenient, expensive, and completely legal. Competitors either sold to him or watched their businesses collapse. By 1867, he'd consolidated multiple lines into one massive system. The New York Central Railroad stretched from New York to Chicago, connecting the East Coast to the rapidly growing Midwest. Vanderbilt now controlled the primary artery of American commerce. The scale of his wealth became almost incomprehensible. At his death in 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt was worth approximately $105 million. Adjusted for the size of the economy, that's roughly $280 billion in modern terms. He was wealthier than Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Bill Gates combined at their peaks. But wealth on that scale creates its own problems. Vanderbilt had 13 children, and he trusted exactly one of them. William Henry Vanderbilt, his eldest son, had worked in the business for decades, proving himself capable. The old Commodore left William 95% of the fortune. The other 12 children received relatively modest inheritances, sparking resentment that would echo through generations. William turned out to be even better at making money than his father. He doubled the family fortune in just 8 years, pushing the Vanderbilt wealth to nearly $200 million by 1885. He expanded the railroad network, improved efficiency, and extracted every possible dollar from the empire his father built. Yet William also made a decision that would ultimately doom the dynasty. He built mansions, lots of them. The Vanderbilt family had always lived comfortably, but William decided they should live like European royalty. He constructed a massive Fifth Avenue palace in New York, setting a standard his children would feel compelled to match. When William died in 1885, he split the fortune between his 8 children. Each received roughly $20 million, still an enormous sum. But here's where the mathematics of dynastic wealth get brutal. 8 heirs meant 8 separate households, each trying to maintain the lifestyle they'd grown up with. Those children built competing monuments to excess. Cornelius Vanderbilt built the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, a 70-room Italian Renaissance palace that cost $7 million in 1895. That's roughly $200 million in today's money. For a summer house they'd use maybe 3 months a year. His brother William built Marble House, another Newport mansion, as a birthday gift for his wife. It featured 500,000 cubic feet of marble shipped from Africa and cost $11 million. Not to be outdone, their brother George Washington Vanderbilt II built Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, a 250-room French chateau that remains the largest private home in America. The construction costs were staggering, but the maintenance costs were worse. Each mansion required dozens of full-time staff. Heating bills alone ran thousands of dollars monthly. Property taxes climbed every year, and the social expectations demanded constant entertaining, expensive parties, and lavish displays that burned through cash at an alarming rate. Meanwhile, the railroad empire was changing. New competitors emerged. Federal regulations increased. Labor unions organized, cutting into profit margins. The Vanderbilt fortune, which had seemed infinite, was being attacked from 2 sides: rising costs and falling revenues. The third generation accelerated the decline, but the seeds of destruction were planted earlier than most people realize. The fourth generation didn't even pretend to care about business. They'd grown up in palaces, educated in Europe, surrounded by servants who anticipated their every need. Most had never worked a day in their lives. Why would they? The money seemed endless. Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, great-grandson of the Commodore, embodied this decline perfectly. He inherited roughly $5 million at age 21. He spent it on horses, parties, and alcohol. His daughter would later become famous not as a business titan, but as Gloria Vanderbilt, a fashion designer who married 4 times and became better known for her genes than her inheritance. By the 1920s, cracks were showing everywhere. The mansions were bleeding money. Several Vanderbilts had already sold their Fifth Avenue palaces, unable to afford the upkeep. The Breakers required a staff of 40 just to maintain it when the family wasn't even there. Property taxes in Newport had skyrocketed. What was once a symbol of dominance had become an anchor dragging them underwater. Then came the Great Depression. The stock market crash of 1929 devastated the remaining Vanderbilt fortune. Railroad stocks plummeted. Real estate values collapsed. The family had diversified into other investments, but most of those investments were built on the same shaky foundation of 1920s speculation that destroyed millions of other Americans. Some Vanderbilts tried to adapt. They sold artwork, jewels, entire mansions. But selling assets in a depression meant accepting pennies on the dollar. A painting that cost $50,000 in 1925 might fetch $5,000 in 1932 if you could find a buyer at all. World War II brought a brief reprieve. The railroads became essential for moving troops and materials. But after the war, the automobile and airplane industries exploded. Interstate highways replaced rail lines as America's primary transportation network. The Vanderbilt Railroad Empire, which had seemed eternal, was becoming obsolete. By 1947, exactly 70 years after the Commodore's death, a family reunion was held at Vanderbilt University. 120 descendants gathered. Not a single one of them was a millionaire. The fortune had evaporated completely within 3 generations. How did this happen? The mathematics are brutal but simple. Start with $100 million. Split it among 8 children. Each gets $12.5 million. Now those 8 children each have multiple children of their own. Let's say 3 each being conservative. That's 24 people splitting what's left of $100 million. Each gets maybe $4 million, assuming the fortune hasn't shrunk at all, which it had. But here's the real killer. Each generation was spending faster than the fortune could possibly grow. Those mansions weren't investments. They were burning piles of cash. Every party, every staff member, every imported marble floor was wealth destruction disguised as wealth display. The Vanderbilts made a critical error that wealthy families throughout history have repeated. They confused assets with income. Owning a 70-room mansion doesn't generate money. It consumes it relentlessly, like a fire that never goes out. Compare this to families who maintain their wealth across generations. The Rothschilds, for instance, established strict rules. Daughters received dowries, but no business control. Sons had to prove themselves before receiving responsibility. The business remained consolidated, not fractured into dozens of competing interests. The Vanderbilts had no such structure. Each heir was free to do whatever they wanted with their share. Some gambled, some drank, some built more ridiculous houses. Without a central family office or trust structure forcing discipline, the money simply scattered like seeds on concrete. There's another factor that people overlook. The Commodore built his fortune during the most explosive period of American economic growth in history. The railroad industry went from nothing to the backbone of the entire economy in 50 years. William doubled the fortune because he inherited a monopoly during its peak profitability. But monopolies don't last forever. Competition increases, technology changes, regulation tightens. The fortune was built on a specific moment in history that could never be repeated. Later generations inherited wealth, but they didn't inherit the conditions that created it. And here's what really matters. The Vanderbilts serve as a warning about the nature of dynastic wealth itself. 3 generations went from richest family in America to not a single millionaire among them. That's not just bad luck. That's structural inevitability when you combine fragmentation, overconsumption, and changing economic conditions. Today, the Vanderbilt name still carries weight, but only as history. The mansions are museums now. Biltmore Estate, that 250-room monument to excess, generates revenue as a tourist attraction. The family that built it couldn't afford to keep it. The irony is sharp enough to cut. There's a lesson buried in this decline that applies far beyond wealthy families. Wealth preservation requires discipline that wealth creation doesn't. Building a fortune demands vision, risk-taking, and relentless drive. Keeping that fortune demands the opposite: caution, structure, and restraint. The Commodore had drive. His children had some discipline. His grandchildren had neither. And his great-grandchildren inherited only the expectations of wealth without any understanding of how to maintain it. So when you hear about billionaire families today, remember the Vanderbilts. Remember that $105 million, an almost incomprehensible fortune, vanished completely within 70 years. Remember that the largest private home in America was built by a family that couldn't afford to keep it for more than a generation. The Vanderbilt story isn't just about the past. It's a template for understanding how quickly empires crumble when the foundation erodes. And that foundation isn't money. It's the systems, structures, and discipline that keep wealth from simply evaporating into the air like steam from a locomotive that's run out of track. Every dynasty eventually faces its reckoning. The Vanderbilts controlled America's railroads, amassed unfathomable wealth, and built monuments to their dominance. 3 generations later, they'd lost everything. The same ambition that built the empire destroyed it through excess, division, and the mistaken belief that wealth could sustain itself without the discipline that created it. Money doesn't preserve itself. Structure does. And without it, even the mightiest fortune becomes nothing more than a cautionary tale carved in marble and left to decay.